What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, a game that I am simultaneously very familiar with, but had never actually played the remastered Zodiac Age version of. And while there are a number of gameplay improvements that are obviously just straight across the board improvements, such as an increased speed factor that you can adjust on the fly, in fact, you're going to see me making a lot of use of that over the course of this video, and even just stuff like an autosave feature that wasn't there in the original, which released all the way back in 2006, to be fair. There are, however, a number of specific gameplay changes that I think are different, but not necessarily better. As an example, they moved a bunch of locations of certain items that you would have normally bought from vendors after a certain point, which is something I noticed almost immediately, and it kind of threw me off a little bit. And we'll obviously get into all that here in just a moment, but I will say, for the most part, this was just a really fun trip down memory lane for me. But to get my usual stuff out of the way, review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video going over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. But in the case of Final Fantasy XII, with the Zodiac Age remaster having released some time ago, like 2017 or 2018, something like that, and the fact that it was a remaster of a game from 2006 meant that pretty much immediately things were solved, everybody knew where everything was. And in my case, I had played the original with my adopted father for hundreds of hours, actually, so I knew exactly what I needed to do for the most part, which included, of course, taking down the super bosses Yasmat, Omega Mark 12, and while I wouldn't exactly call him a super boss, you got Zodiark in there as well. And you can see all of these victories individually via the in-game Sky Pirates Den, or basically just a visualization of the game's achievements, which was also present in the original as well. From there, though, let's get into it. How is the Zodiac Age completely different from the original version? Well, let's talk about some of those initial features. Probably the biggest by far is the job system. So the original game used a license board as well, but basically everybody had access to the same progression, and while they had different stats and would obviously equip different gear, for the most part everyone could do everything because of the blanket nature of how it worked there. In the Zodiac Age, each character has to pick a job, or a class essentially, and while you can double them up later, or respec, you are limited to what those classes combined are able to do at the time, meaning that everyone has a much more specific role to play typically, which is obviously going to just immediately be very different. On top of that, this version did actually introduce some new armor and weapons, though for the most part, they made some of the best stuff easier to obtain while adding even better stuff that is extremely rare, but often completely unnecessary. For instance, everyone often talks about a bow that only shows up in a chest that has an incredibly low chance of appearing, like infinitesimally small. And the thing is, while you could potentially try to grind that out, you also just don't need that. It's not required or necessary for literally anything. But stuff that was notoriously difficult to obtain in the original, like the Zodiac Spear, has been given much more reliable methods of getting it every single time. And in fact, due to some changes in a couple of the boss fights after which you would have gotten that spear, it's actually been made more useful than it was originally anyway. Other changes include the addition of Trial Mode, pretty much what it sounds like, a series of 100 stages of increasing difficulty that you can undertake with your current playthrough. You start this from the main menu, and then if you load up the main game with that save, it will actually import all your progress from the trial mode into the main game, which is a decent way to grind if you want to do that. It's pretty fun, but if you're capable of beating the game's super bosses and everything, you should really probably have no trouble at all with the game's trial mode, as it is, in my opinion, a bit easier, frankly. We've also got New Game Plus and New Game Minus. New Game Plus is more or less what it sounds like. After you beat the game, you can start New Game Plus, which the only main difference is that it gives all of your characters a base level of 90. And if you really wanted to, what you could do is blitz through the main story of the game and then activate New Game Plus to essentially power level your characters without actually having to do it, only to then try to wrap up everything on New Game Plus. It's not necessary to do that, but you could certainly do it. And then there is New Game Minus. New Game Minus is interesting because what it does is prevent your characters from leveling up past their sort of base level that you pick them up at. And what this means is that you have to rely on things like the power improvements from your license board, as well as their actual equipment. And while it can sound rough, and it certainly is a challenge, it's not as bad as it sounds because most of your improvements come from those two things anyway, with level mainly providing you extra health and MP. And then other stuff is a little on the smaller side, but is certainly quality of life for sure. So for instance, we have that speed up mode. You can increase the game's speed by up to 4 times. And not only is that really helpful for, the slower parts of the game where you're just running through wide open areas, it's actually also really useful in a couple of boss fights as well. So there are a couple of bosses towards the end of the game that their attacks have no charge time, which means they simply act as fast as the animation plays. Whereas your characters obviously don't have that advantage. And in the just regular speed of the game, you're actually moving a bit slow. And so while it's a relatively small advantage, you do actually get an advantage in those fights by speeding the game up, because then you act faster, but they're still limited by their animation speed. They've also added the ability to overlay a map, which you'll also be seeing me make a fair bit of use of. And then there's the obvious stuff like the visual and audio enhancements. For the audio in particular, I really thought it was neat that they allowed you to choose from either the original music or the remastered music. They also added the ability to autosave when you enter most rooms or zones on the map, which is especially helpful in keeping you from having to run back from certain boss fights, such as Omega Mark 12 and the Great Crystal, which is notoriously difficult to navigate. And then finally, there are actually some sort of built-in cheats that don't affect much besides your own personal enjoyment. So you can max out the amount of money you have at any time, and you can max out your license points, meaning you can fully unlock the license board whenever you're ready. And I did go ahead and make use of these myself. In particular, once I got to the part of the game, the Namyensa Sansi to be specific, where I would normally grind out license points in the original game, is when I went ahead and saved myself some time and popped the max license board just to spare myself the hours actually grinding it out. And the max gold or gil I used pretty early on so I wouldn't have to farm money, just so you know. But moving on from what this game in particular adds, let's talk about how it is running. So probably unsurprisingly at this point, I'm happy to say that this game had minimal technical problems, a couple minor bugs here and there, but that was pretty much it. I would say really the only issue of note is that the game is a little prickly about the screen options, which is going to come up again in the Steam Deck section. But depending on stuff like your monitors, your setup, whether or not this game wants to be in windowed, borderless, or full screen is going to change. And while I, for the most part, played it in full screen, there were a couple of times where it just kept popping back into windowed mode, which was kind of annoying, but, not the end of the world either. From there, though, let's go ahead and move on to the story setup and talk a bit about that. So the story of Final Fantasy XII is an interesting one, because on one hand, it is my favorite Final Fantasy game, but for the most part, I think the story is just okay. In many ways, it's really just a big political drama back and forth between two empires before, at the end, sort of bringing in a fantasy existential crisis to the world of Ivalice, which is the specific world in which this particular game takes place. And while I don't want to go plot beat for plot beat here, there's a couple of things to know for sure. So right away, the game is throwing a bunch of names and places and political back and forth at you. But the long and short of it is basically that the imperial nation of Arcadia and the empire of Rosaria are at war, and there's several nations caught in the middle. Arcadia uses a bunch of political maneuvering to set up the fall of two countries pretty much back to back, those being Nebradia and the one that the game primarily takes place around, Dalmasca. This involved invading and shutting down Nebradia only to force Dalmasca to surrender, but use the signing of the treaty at which they announced their surrender as a coup operation to kill the king while blaming it on his guards, trying to set up Arcadia as these lawful peace bringers who are only seeking to restore law and order to the kingdom, especially after the use of some sort of magical disaster known as Nethicite ultimately, but you could more or less think of as a magical nuke, and the Nethicite reduces Nebradia to what are now known as the Nebrius Deadlands, because that's where the existential crisis part comes in. You see everything going on between them, the war between Arcadia and Rosaria, or the Cold War initially, turns out to all be in service of trying to figure out the Nethicite, because the ancient history of this realm is that there are actually gods known as the Ocuria, or the Undying, who have guided human history the way they see fit. They are, for the most part, seen as the gods of the realm, and it turns out that Arcadia is using any means necessary to buck that particular tradition, and the way they do that is with the help of one of the Undying known as Vana. Vana, in communication with Dr. Cid of Arcadia, does a bunch of experimentation and all of the work necessary basically to bring the power of Nethicite into human hands so they no longer have to follow the whims of the Ocuria. It just so happens that they're causing untold human suffering and all the other races of Evilise while they're at it, which is obviously where we have to step in. So frankly, it's a story with a lot going on, but I wanted to talk about a few things that often come up when talking about this, which is that a lot of people make some comparison to Star Wars as an example, and to be fair, there are a lot of similarities there. It's definitely not one for one, but we do play the role of a relatively unlucky kid coming from a desert area. There's an empire of the big bad guys. They have an elite cadre of more or less inquisitors. There's a city-state known as Bujerba situated in the clouds, and the leader there does temporarily give you up to the imperial custody of Arcades, but he almost immediately makes up for this by also giving access to this place to the Resistance, which allows you to free the Princess of Dalmasca, one of the playable characters known as Ash. So, is it an exact one-for-one? No, not by any means, but, people don't make those comparisons out of nowhere. There are certainly some similarities. Another big complaint you'll hear about the story, though, is the primary party member, which is Vaughn. Now, the thing is, you actually play as 6 characters overall. Vaughn, his friend Penello, Balthier, a sky pirate, his partner Fran, Captain Bosch von Ronsenberg of the Dalmascan Guard, and then, of course, Princess Ash. Now, all of these characters have a direct connection to the main story, which brings them all together in some way, but admittedly, Vaughn's is the most tenuous, and there does come a point in the main story where his connection to it has largely been resolved. And at that point, it's really more of a just he's in too deep to back out now kind of situation more than anything else. But Vaughn is the younger brother of one of the soldiers that was set up by the Imperial Empire Arcadia to take the fall for the murder of the King of Dalmasca, meaning that Vaughn's older brother Rex, in fact, was the literal witness that they needed. They attacked him but left him alive to spread the word of what happened, specifically about the supposed betrayal of Bosch, one of the guards of Dalmasca that is framed for the king's murder because he actually has a twin brother who did the deed, with Bosch himself being imprisoned shortly after. Penello is just Vaughn's childhood friend. They grew up on the streets of Dalmasca because the game itself takes place a couple years after those incidents, and as orphans, they're mostly just trying to get by, so Penello's just along for the ride. Balthier is Dr. Cid's son and the sky pirate who's in league with Fran, his partner in crime, who is herself an exiled Viera, that is to say one of these bunny women that leaves the forest from which they are from, but there's no coming back after they do that, they're shunned. And then Princess Ash and Bosch have readily apparent reasons for being involved. Princess Ash, once you rescue her, after discovering she is still alive to begin with, she's captured by Arcadia, and then you go rescue her. And she obviously wants her kingdom back, and to make up for the death of her husband, the heir to Nebradia, who was killed, of course, when all of that went down. They had been married just prior to the invasions. Bosch obviously wants to protect what's left of Dalmasca and hopefully clear his name of a crime he did not commit, so you can kind of see what all of these characters' individual connections to the story. I get what people are saying when they say that Vaughn has the weakest connection, which is true, he does, but it's also not nothing either. I would say Vaughn's biggest crime really is just being a bit boring, to be honest, as he is not a particularly interesting fellow, has some funny one-liners here and there, but that's about it. And he is sort of outclassed in that regard in the sense that almost all of the other characters besides maybe Penello are infinitely more interesting. So there is that. Broad strokes though, the story's decent. I think depending on how much you like this type of narrative is really obviously going to make or break it. But as Final Fantasy stories go, I think it's alright. From there though, let's talk progression systems, because each of those 6 characters will be leveling up, increasing their licenses, working up their gear, potentially unlocking summonings and quickenings, which we're all going to have to make use of. Now the catch here is though, one thing that has not changed from the original is that each party member gains experience individually, meaning that the ones you are actively using are the ones gaining experience, which means you do need to swap them out if you are planning on, of course, actually leveling everybody up. Personally, I cycle them out based on a bit of a system, so it's not overwhelming or anything, but something to know for sure. Now, as I mentioned earlier, levels are pretty straightforward. Most of what they do is increase your health and your available magic to use your skills and the like. That is because most of your actual power comes from your licenses in particular. So each character, when you get them, is going to be assigned one of 12 jobs. This makes up their initial license board, and that license board, as you kill enemies, you get license points to spend on it, and this is going to give you, in some cases, just straight power increases to things like magic or physical attacks, but also is going to grant you access to the ability to use the gear and spells and abilities you'll be finding. So just because you have gear and stuff in your inventory doesn't mean you get to use it right away. You actually have to have the license to use it. In the original version, everybody had more or less the same license board, with a couple of minor variations based on their quickenings or their espers. But because of this, everybody could use everything if you took the time to do that. Whereas here, each character has a more set role, and obviously that's going to come down to preference more than anything else. I didn't mind it in that sense. And while you don't need to make use of every job available to you, especially considering you can double them up a little bit later, that is going to allow you to, of course, use 2 different jobs in order to make use of both of what they have in terms of spells and techniques and whatnot. And you can even switch job boards fairly early on in the game too, so more than anything, I'd actually just recommend you play around with these and see which one you like the most. Now, in addition to the power boost you get from the license board directly, the rest of it comes from your gear. Gear plays a huge role in what your characters are capable of. In fact, one thing I really like about this game is that a lot of gear has uses for specific situations, and because of that, there is no really one set best item for just any given character, but rather there are best items to use in certain fights and approaches to them as a result. For instance, even relatively weak armor like windbreakers will do things like halve wind damage, which can be used situationally against the super boss Yasmat, because his main attack is Cyclone, which is wind based, and you can just half the damage from that if you wanted to. But there's also other ways around that, so it's not necessarily required either. But generally speaking, there are 3 types of equipment: light, medium, or heavy, each with different effects on your character's stats, which do actually matter. For instance, the heavier stuff lowers your speed, which means you don't get to act as often. Whereas obviously the light stuff doesn't provide quite as much defense typically. So there's some back and forth there even before you start looking at the extra effects like absorbing specific elemental types, especially when you consider that some bosses, if your entire party is immune or halving the damage from their main damage type, will actually perform secondary antics instead, such as Zodiac. Now, this is especially noteworthy, though, when you get to talking about weapons, because there are actually a bunch of different weapon types in Final Fantasy XII, and each of them does different things. In fact, some of them even have a lot of a hidden mechanic called comboing. So melee weapons, in particular, can have the ability to combo, that is to say, perform more than one hit in a given attack. Certain weapon types have a higher chance to do this than others. In particular, things like your ninja blades have a pretty high chance. The best weapon of the game, which you get too late for it to be of much use, called the Worm Hero Blade, actually has an 80% base chance to combo. But the thing there is that you can actually use an item to bring that up to a 100% chance, as an example, and that's one of the ways you could potentially use those different weapons. But gun weapons, or piercing weapons in general, technically bypass all of an enemy's defense, which is great for some fights, but some enemies don't actually rely on a high defensive stat to mitigate damage. So, not to mention that those guns come with a relatively lower overall power anyway, which means they'll deal great damage if they are punching through an enemy's high defense, but against an enemy with a lower defense, you'll actually get more damage out of other weapons. A cool thing about guns and bows, though, is that you can equip things like shot or arrows to them as well, which can add additional effects to whatever the weapon itself is doing, which is also the case for things like hand bombs, as an example. So there's actually quite a bit to gear progression and things to consider when you are using any individual weapon. Now, for the most part, it's not exactly super complicated, so if you just use weapon with better attack, you will generally do better. But if you want to get super deep into it, there is quite a bit to consider, and it's one of the ways in which I think Final Fantasy XII feels more like a CRPG than pretty much any Final Fantasy title, especially when you start talking about the combat here in just a little bit. And I think that in particular is one of the things that kept me coming back to the game quite often. But there is a little bit more to talk about in terms of progression, and that is primarily espers and the quickenings. So each character gets 3 quickenings, 1 of each stage. Quickenings are effectively like these special attacks you can do in combat that you can chain together to perform various concurrences. That is to say, you use enough of these magical abilities in unison with the rest of your party, and you'll get some special effect. One of the more annoying achievements this game has is called Mistwalker, where you have to activate every single type of concurrence, which is to say all 8 elements. This is frustrating because it's really just down to RNG, because the final one, Black Hole, is notoriously difficult to proc, as you have to perform 4 of each rank 1, 2, and 3 quickening in a party, meaning that you have to, mid-quickening chain, manage to recharge them, which is down to RNG because you shuffle the sort of roll you get as you attempt to chain these together. And sometimes that works out for you and sometimes it does not, frankly. Now, espers are a little more on the simple side. You will fight various summons across the game. Some are hidden, some are part of the main story. And once you do that, you can unlock the license for them on the license board, which allows that particular character to summon them into combat. Now, both espers and quickenings are useful in the early game, but are essentially useless by the late game, especially against some of the super bosses. They are not very good at all once you get to that point. But that does bring us to the gameplay and world section. So, a lot to cover here, but generally speaking, one of the main things I like about Final Fantasy XII is just how much all of it feels like a connected world, which is not something the Final Fantasy games always land, especially in later entries like, for instance, Final Fantasy XVI is one I don't think really quite manages to do it. But in 12, this basically consists of a bunch of zones which make up the various interconnected areas of the game. So this is divided up into cities, of course. Cities you're forced to run around as Vaughn, as he is technically the main character, but in the actual exploration zones you have your regular party, where you're going to engage with what is effectively real-time with pause combat, while you hunt down things like your main story objectives, hidden side quests, and the various hunts of the game. So, outside of the main story, it's probably worth a mention that there are a variety of hidden things that the game never tells you about. This includes both side quests, which you can track down just based on your own intuition, hidden stuff like those espers I've already mentioned, but also hunting down rare game, which are rare spawns more or less, for the Hunt Club on the Fawn Coast, which is one of the new ways you can get the Zodiac Spear, or just chasing down regular old hunts as you join a sort of hunter or headhunters guild relatively early on in the game, where you'll hunt down dangerous enemies for various rewards. And that is what ultimately concludes with the fight with Yasmat, the game's super boss to end all super bosses. Now, one big thing about the Zodiac Age in particular that I actually did not like, because I think it felt less like a world as a result, is that in the original, as you progressed the game, various spells and abilities would then be available at vendors across the world. In the Zodiac Age, what they've done instead is, there is technically a little bit of that, don't get me wrong, but rather most of the spells and items that you would really want have instead been dispersed across the game's various zones that you then have to go find in what typically look like normal treasures. Luckily, most of these are in a set location, but not all of them. In fact, some of them have only a % chance of appearing if you are in that zone, which makes getting them really annoying because you have to zone in and out until it shows up. And to me, basically removing the need to go around to the various towns more often and talk to people made the game feel a little less alive, as an example. And in particular, one specific instance of this is that in a place called the Necro Hall of Nabudis, there is a secret merchant. I knew exactly where to go find this guy. He had, in the original version, some of the best spells in the game after a certain point, and that has mostly been removed. That merchant kind of sucks now, because most of the stuff he would have given you is now available elsewhere, and that's a real bummer to me. I actually didn't care for that change much at all. That is in combination, though, with the new rare weapons, the best items and things that were added to the Zodiac Age. The method of acquisition for a lot of this stuff hasn't really changed. That is to say, you have to steal it off of bosses, hope it drops on an enemy from a rare spawn, as an example, which means a lot of the best stuff, which again you do not need, has to be tracked down sort of MMO style, where there's a % chance of it dropping or being stolen from a specific enemy type. And in particular, I think that specifically is why you'll often hear people refer to this as a single-player MMO type of game, which I don't think quite is true, but in that specific instance, I can see why people say that. In particular, though, one of the reasons you would probably want to hunt down some of those items is, in fact, to help you with the game's various hunts and optional bosses, which can be very difficult even if those things aren't actually required. So the main hunt guild that you join up with is pretty straightforward. You can accept bills either from the clan master for the elite guys or the regular marks from just various notice boards in bars and things like that across the game's various settlements. And this will of course point you in the direction of various contracts to slay certain monsters. These typically have a bit of story associated with them, and what's more, they often provide either unique rewards in the form of literal items or unlocking access to other things. As an example, there are multiple side quests and access to certain places that you can only obtain by actually completing some of these hunts. For instance, you can't fully explore the Garum Scythe waterway until you get a key from one of the hunts that you'll be doing called the White Moose or White Pudding, something like that. And sometimes what these hunts will do is actually unlock the sort of progression in the world you need to go find a certain item unrelated to that hunt. As an example, in order to get access to the deepest reaches of the Lusu mines in Bujerba, you have to complete a hunt for an antlion, which will then drop a key, or you'll learn about a key that was dropped from the floating island that is Bujerba that washes up on shore in the Fawn Coast. And you can then go get that key, which will then give you access to the final ability to hunt down Gilgamesh for his hunt. So hunts play a pretty central role in sort of gating off access to certain areas, but also ensuring that you are decently strong enough to actually be trying to do those things anyway. Now, be it from exploring or simply taking down enemies in these hunts, all sorts of stuff like that, you're going to be picking up tons of loot. You're going to be selling that loot, of course, to various vendors, which is where the game's bazaar comes in. By selling specific combinations of loot to vendors, you can unlock special deals. Sometimes this is items before you would potentially have access to them, though that rarely actually happens. Other times it is super secret items that you can only get this way, such as the Tournesol or the Worm Hero Blade. Though the Worm Hero Blade is the weapon that is technically the best, but you get so late it's not really useful. Unfortunately, what the Zodiac Age does not do is add any in-game way of tracking what you've sold to the bazaar, or how to do that, so you either have to keep track of it manually or just ignore it and get what you get, which can actually be a little more annoying than it sounds because of the way the game actually tracks the items that you have sold to the bazaar. Basically, anytime a bazaar triggers with the items you have sold, it resets the in-game counter to those sold items to 0 regardless of how many you've actually sold, which means for various bazaar entries that utilize the same type of loot, it can actually be really annoying to try to get a specific thing unless you sell all of it at once and you know exactly what you're looking for, as an example. So an in-game counter there would have been really helpful. The game does feature a bunch of unmarked side quests as well. I've already mentioned one of them, the Hunt Club on the Fawn Coast, which sees you hunting down rare game. In particular, very specific types of rare game that only show up once this has been accepted, and under very specific conditions. So rare game in general can come down to things like the exact time of day you're doing it, or the in-game timer, actually, to be specific, a % chance to spawn when you zone in somewhere, or even specific circumstances that guarantee the spawn, like hanging out in a certain area for so long, or going to a certain area and waiting, that kind of thing. Some of these, the rarest of the rare that require those special unlock conditions, will actually also drop trophies that you can turn into the Hunt Club, which can get you special items, which is the new guaranteed way to get the Zodiac Spear very easily if you turn all of the trophies into the weapons trophy guy, ATAC. But there's other stuff as well. There is, of course, a surprisingly hidden fishing minigame you can get up to, all of that. But along the way, you're going to be navigating through the game, which typically comes down to either teleporting or flying. So the game does use a manual save system on top of its new autosaves, which sees you saving at the game's various save crystals. Blue ones are normal. The orange ones, however, allow the use of teleport stones, which allows you to teleport from any teleport crystal that you've discovered up to that point, allowing you to quickly get around. Late in the game, you can use Balthier's airship, the Strahl, but that is typically just worse than using the teleport stone, so even once you unlock it, there's not a lot of reason to actually use it. But even outside of all of that, just a couple other minor things to mention. Traps. So one of the techniques you'll get in the game is called Libra, and you'll use Libra to actually see both enemy information but also traps that have been laid on the ground. In the early game, traps are kind of whatever. Even if you do hit them, in the late game they are very deadly, or they have the potential to be deadly and very annoying, so you'll want to know that. There are ways to get around traps, like using a float spell or items that allow you to pass over them unharmed, that kind of thing. Though to be fair, you may be spending a lot of time in the same areas and simply learn their locations over time, because another thing you can do is chain enemies together. Killing the exact same type of enemy over and over again increases your chain of kills on that enemy, which then increases the loot rewards, which can be really helpful for either grinding out cash or if you're looking for a specific item to sell to the bazaar that drops a little more rarely. And so, when you combine all of that together, I think Final Fantasy XII has a lot to do in terms of exploration, to the point where I would say completing the main story is probably only like half of the game. There's so much content and things to do outside of just that, but admittedly, most of that revolves around, of course, hunting down monsters, as well as optimizing your equipment to then finally take on those last few super bosses. Now, one thing in particular before I wanted to move on from this section is talk about probably my least favorite part of the entire game, which is the Great Crystal. The Great Crystal is essentially a dungeon, except it has no map, and it all looks extremely similar, and you have to go around and use various stones with a timer in order to unlock the various gates to navigate the place. And while the story section that brings you here is relatively linear, the optional stuff, which comes down to hunting the Esper Ultima alongside finding Omega Mark 12 to destroy him once you've unlocked Yasmat, is incredibly frustrating, and they've actually made it a little worse by adding some of the new spell locations that they've taken away from vendors into this place as well, and it's a real nightmare navigating this place, and I did not remember it fondly, and I don't enjoy it more now, for sure. Luckily, the autosave feature does help a little bit in here, but it's still just not a fun time. Next up, though, let's finally talk about combat. This one tends to be a little polarizing because, on one hand, I think combat is really cool because it uses its gambit system, which is something you'll probably recognize if you've played later games like Dragon Age Origins or Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. Because the gambit system, essentially, once you unlock it, is a system of if-then statements that you can assign to a character that basically allow them to automate certain actions in a fight. Now, the thing is, if you set this up properly, you can run through the main story without even so much as doing much of anything yourself outside of maybe the occasional pause to do something specific, almost entirely automated. Now, that said, that is a lot harder to do for the optional content. You're more likely to play a more active role there, having to pause and make decisions in the moment, especially against creatures like Yasmat and Zodiac, which can cause instant death that will pierce through protections. And thus there's an element of RNG there that the gambit system can't really account for. Now, when you first get access to the system, you're relatively limited, but one of the vendors in the various cities and settlements is the gambit vendor, and you'll be able to essentially buy all of the if-then statements, and then as you get access to spells and things, that will naturally fill in the action you want the characters to take. Now, as somebody who loves a lot of isometric CRPGs that often utilize some amount of party AI or real-time with pause, though admittedly lately it's trending more towards turn-based these days, but real-time with pause is still a common method of those games, and as a result of that, I felt right at home here, and I think it's one of the reasons I love this game so much, to be honest. But whether or not you like that system is probably going to, of course, then decide whether or not you enjoy the rest of the game's real-time with pause combat. Because, as mentioned, it mostly pops up in the optional stuff. You can very easily breeze through the main story with little trouble at all with some really basic setups, because the game was never exactly complicated, because most of the challenge comes from the optional bosses later, where you have to have complicated setups that we'll get into. Now, after level 55 or so, you're mostly just giving yourself a health buffer at that point, because once you've reached the end of the story, you've hit around level 55, it's pretty much all down to gear and strategy anyway. Before you reach that point, you can utilize espers and quickenings to help you out. These guys are useful very early on, but as also mentioned earlier, they fall off hard once you get to the optional stuff later, because the quickenings and espers combined simply don't do enough damage to really move the needle in a lot of fights, especially the super bosses like Hellworm or Yasmat, which have so much health, millions upon millions in fact, that utilizing just regular weapons and strategy is more effective there. But in combat, you pretty much have what you would expect. Your basic attack actions based on the equipment that character has, but then they can also use things like magic or techniques. Magic is broken into a variety of different types that in the Zodiac Age, depending on your character's job, you'll have different amounts of access to. For instance, White Mage is mostly healing, of course. Black Mage is most of your offensive black magic spells. Red Battle Mage will allow you to use most things, but typically not the highest level spells available to each. Just as a few examples. Now there is a little bit of mix and matching here and there because some classes do get really minimal access to other healing spells, such as the base level white magic, that kind of thing. So what you can offset that is that some of these jobs get access to various techniques, non-magical abilities and skills you can activate that are, in a lot of cases, typically worse than their magical counterpart, outside of a few exceptions. The most useful of these techniques by far is going to be the stat-reducing ones you can put on enemies permanently, which is incredibly effective for long-haul boss fights like Yasmat. And as far as the basics go, that really is pretty much it. So a lot of that comes down to the strategy that you're utilizing, setting up the right gear at the right time, setting up your gambits to do the right thing at the right time, to dispel enemies accordingly, understanding enemy mechanics, and reacting to those accordingly as well. Sometimes that's easier than others, so to give a few examples, first up you've got the Hellworm. The Hellworm is hidden behind a small puzzle in an area called the Sochin Cave Palace. You have to solve a puzzle to access the door that he's behind, and then you have to go find the key from doing a hunt and turning it into an item, which unlocks the door to the Hellworm. And the Hellworm is a completely optional side boss that you have to complete before you can access the harder super bosses of Omega Mark 12 and Yasmat, but the Hellworm is basically a prelude to Yasmat specifically, as that fight functions a bit differently in the sense that it has a massive amount of health. I think the Hellworm has like 10 million, something like that. But the catch is you can actually just leave the fight at any time, and as long as you do it quickly enough, in Yasmat's case, so he doesn't cast regen on himself, you can leave the area, heal up, get ready, and come back into the fight. This makes the Hellworm in particular not that difficult once you have a good setup. Now the catch there, though, is Yasmat. Yasmat comes in two forms, the trial mode version and the normal game version. The trial mode version is a lot easier because his health is reduced by almost 95%. This guy is the reason I was actually dreading reviewing this game finally, or getting back to playing the Zodiac Age, because while he's actually not all that difficult in this particular version at all, in the original version, Yasmat was a nightmare. He had about 50 million HP, and he would take normally 3 to 4 hours to defeat under normal circumstances, assuming you still knew what you were doing. Now the catch there is there were a couple of methods you could do much faster. For instance, I think at least the record that I was aware of at the time was a little under an hour, with obviously an immense amount of prep work that went into that. But thankfully, here with the small changes that have been made alongside the 4x speed, you can pretty easily kill Yasmat in under an hour, even with a suboptimal method. But outside of just having a ton of health, what makes this guy so hard? Well, the catch really is that a lot of his attacks just have a straight up chance to kill you. That will pierce through pretty much all protections, and if you try to range away from the guy, he starts using an ability called Death Strike, which will just instantly kill you unless you have the spell Shell on, at which point it just becomes a 50% chance to outright kill you, and he can spam it without end. This means that even under perfectly optimal settings and conditions, you're still just going to have a % chance to die, and sometimes that RNG just doesn't go your way. Now the good news is, especially with the changes they've made to Zodiac Age, this fight is easier than ever, even beyond just the health pool and the speed increase. You see, another thing the Zodiac Age actually does is removes the damage caps. At one point, this was just 9,999 like it usually is, but in the original version, this meant that the best weapons to fight Yasmat with were the weapons with high combo chances, because you were just hitting that maximum, especially when he gets a huge increase to his defenses partway through the fight that then capped it at 6,999. With the removal of those damage caps, the more traditional weapons like the Zodiac Spear as an example are a lot more effective than they were in that original version, which means you can fight with those combo weapons like you always could, and that's still an effective way. This change has actually made it so that more weapons are better here, which makes it easier by default before we start talking about the changes they made to a few of the techniques that reduce enemy stats. Basically, those are just easier to land now, and they last until you leave the area. Meaning that while Yasmat has an ability called like Cyclone that deals a bunch of damage, and his attacks could hit you really hard, if you spam things like the technique Wither at him, it will reduce his strength until his individual attacks are doing like maybe 50 HP, at which point the only thing you have to worry about is really just his instant death mechanics, which due to the RNG can sometimes get a bad hold of you and you're kind of on a sort of back foot all of a sudden. But barring that, he's mostly a sitting duck at that point. So they have made this fight very, very easy in the Zodiac Age version is what I'm trying to get across here, but it's not the only fight of note. I think the other two we really talk about are Zodiark and Omega Mark II. So Zodiark is interesting because he's the hidden Esper, the final summon, the 13th one as a matter of fact. I remembered not liking this fight a lot in the original version, but I didn't remember why until I started fighting this guy again here, and it's because so much of this fight is RNG, and I forgot just how annoying it was. Basically, Zodiark uses a move called Darkja or something like that, and it has a not insignificant chance to kill your characters, and it will pierce through protections, all that. So it's just a flat chance to instantly kill your characters, and it's high enough that him wiping out your entire party the second you enter the arena is not unheard of, and thus you're going to have to reload kind of regardless of what your strategy there was, because he's going to get you on the back foot with your reserve team, and when you bring in your reserve team, you're going to have to spend a few seconds kind of getting your team back up to speed, at which point he's just going to use the move again. Which is annoying, but there is, of course, some good news. With the removal of the damage cap, this fight is also a little easier because you can deal so much damage to him so fast, you can actually push him through his phases super quickly and sort of just overwhelm him because his actual health pool is relatively small, thankfully. And while he is actually buffed to the nines when you step into the fight, if you refrain from actually dispelling him, let him keep his buffs, it keeps him from sort of going berserk towards the end of the fight. He just doesn't do stuff he would normally do. And so you can make that easier through those strategies. But because of the RNG nature of a lot of his abilities, that fight is particularly annoying, even if it is easier now. Now, ironically, the final super boss, Omega Mark 12, is honestly pretty easy because of, again, the way they changed Wither and stuff to work here. So Omega Mark 12's whole thing, his whole strategy, is that he hits insanely hard. Like pretty much any character, any level, you're dead in 1 to 2 hits. And he does not stop attacking, but he only has that one attack. It's all he does for the whole fight. With the only other thing of note being that he occasionally switches his elemental resistances based on what you're hitting him with. So while it can be difficult to get this fight going because he's killing you so fast, if you take a couple of attempts to start hitting him with Wither, which will reduce his strength and thus reduce his attacks, you can also reduce his damage down to basically nothing, at which point he just doesn't really pose much of a threat. And all you really have to do at that point is cure the occasional cast of Berserk he'll put on you, but even that isn't that dangerous in this context. And for me at least, having come back to this game after all this time, it was really fun to see the changes and the slight differences in strategy and methods that have been worked and reworked here that have made these fights simultaneously easier but still interesting enough to be engaging, which is what I personally appreciated about it the most. But again, this type of combat isn't going to be for everybody. And in fact, I would say most of the biggest complaints I hear about this game usually come down to the way its combat system works. But of course, that's a decision you gotta make for yourself. Now that does finally bring us to the Steam Deck section. So the Steam Deck for this game is interesting because it is in fact verified, but I had to do some fiddling to get it to work at all. So the default version of Proton wasn't really working, and just a quick lookup, it looks like if you switch to the experimental version, it seems to solve most of the issues with it, mine included. At that point, it's kind of understandable that it would have that verified rating. Really, the only thing to note after you do that is that sometimes, again, the exact screen settings seem to go a little wonky, which was an issue I had on PC as well. So you might have to mess around with like whether you're running it in borderless or full screen, that type of thing, as it, again, seems very intermittent as to what it will actually want you to be playing in. But if you're willing to mess around with those settings, which isn't really a huge deal, this game runs perfectly well on the Steam Deck, and that would probably be a pretty good place to play it. Which does bring us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things. For me, in particular, it was the gambit and combat systems by far. I really enjoy that type of system. I think they did the gambit system really, really well, and it's probably no surprise then that good games after this also used it in the form of Dragon Age Origins or Pillars of Eternity to Deadfire. Another thing I really enjoy about this game, though, is just how much it feels like an actual world to explore, which is not something the Final Fantasy series always gets right. I think there are certainly a few other instances in which, you have your world maps and your airships and everything, and it feels good enough in that sense, but it often can feel a little theme parky at times, whereas, especially in the original version, because of, everything you have to do in various areas alongside how to get rare game to spawn and how interactive a lot of the actual exploration can be, it felt more alive, especially in 2006 when I originally played it, obviously not so much compared to modern day stuff, in a way that other Final Fantasies just seem to lack, and that's before you even start finding all of the unmarked stuff, all the hidden things. Like, I remember the first time I managed to solve the puzzle to find the Esper Chaos in the Necro Hall of Nabudis all by myself, because I played this back before internet guides were as prominent as they are now, so I just had to sort a lot of it out. And I was really blown away by it back then. And while these days that discoverability is certainly more down to, how long is it going to take for you to decide to just look it up, but in spite of that, it still feels like a game that is more alive than a lot of its other entries in the series, which is something I just really enjoy. But there are nonetheless some negatives, of course. Mostly this is down to just minor stuff that I find annoying. In particular, there's still a lot of minor annoyances in this game that I'm surprised the Zodiac Age didn't fix in particular. Though, actually looking it up, it does seem like they maybe couldn't have fixed them. Like, for instance, you can't skip the final credits scene for some reason, and I looked into it, and apparently it has something to do with the way the game was coded, and they could not change that. But also other stuff like the changes they made to the locations of various spells and abilities and things that you want your characters to have, those being moved into percent chance stuff to find in just the various world zones you may or may not go into at a given time just feels bad, to me at least, in comparison to having set locations that were available after certain story moments, because it gave you a specific reason to go talk to merchants and things in all the different settlements and cities, which means you were more likely to then find the side quests that are unmarked. An easy example of that is the side quest in the Giza Plains with the Nomad Village to go find their lost cockatrices, or like chickens more or less, that have escaped after a certain point. You're less likely to discover that because I don't have a reason to regularly go check in with the merchants and stuff there to see if they have new stuff. So that was a change I actually didn't enjoy, and there's just little stuff like that all throughout the game. Now, obviously, the bigger things are going to be more subjective. I obviously really enjoyed the combat, but, whether you like that combat or not is obviously going to decide whether or not it's a very large negative for you. A lot of people don't like Vaughn as a main character, and admittedly, he's a bit of a boring character in comparison to many of your other party members. So while I'm pretty neutral about him, I could see that being a big deal for people. And I think that's largely why then you get such a polarizing take when it comes to Final Fantasy XII, which is naturally then the place to bring this to a conclusion. So for me, Final Fantasy XII is my favorite Final Fantasy game. I love the total experience. There are parts of it that I think other games do better, to be sure. There are certainly more interesting main characters. There are certainly parts of this game that feel clunky, that kind of thing. And yet, despite its shortcomings, perhaps because I played this game so much as a teenager with my adopted father, it really is just a game that I love. And when it comes to the Zodiac Age in particular, I'm a little split on it, because there are in fact a whole host of just flat out improvements, things that just make this game better, and yet some of the actual gameplay changes I'm kind of mixed on. For instance, having played the original with the full license board available for each character, while it's not a huge deal at the end of the day, it does wind up feeling a little restrictive in certain places when I have to use a certain character to use a certain healing spell without just respecking it, as opposed to being able to do more or less everything on each character, even if they had strength and weaknesses based on their actual inherent stats. The changes to the locations for the various items and weapons and stuff, the way acquiring some of the best weapons and things actually works, the fact that they added even more ridiculously difficult to obtain items that don't really serve much of a purpose anyway. So when it comes to a conclusion about the Zodiac Age specifically, it's definitely the easiest way to play this game these days, not least of which because its actual availability, but also because of the just straight up improvements to gameplay, like, even just something as basic as the autosave, as an example, was added here. They also made a bunch of changes that I'm not entirely sold on either, that, maybe it's just nostalgia, but I just didn't feel quite as strongly about them as I did the original version's implementation of those systems. And as a result of that, while I do think the Zodiac Age is, again, probably the easiest way to play this game these days, that is going to give you the best experience, I also do want to point out that I wouldn't really just call it straight up better than the original version, just different, outside of those quality of life changes, which I suppose is perhaps the most individually surprising thing to me about this review. Because I wanted to end this particular video on a bit of a personal note. I've alluded to it a little bit, but while many people are aware if they watch my channel with regularity, I am in fact adopted. I was adopted formally at the age of 17, which is a little late, but it was an adoption by a family that had taken me in when I was 13, and it's a long history, but basically I stayed with them for a little while before my biological mom managed to get us back, but being the ever unstable person that she was, wound up in poor situations again that ultimately saw me homeless from the ages of 15 to 17 before I made my way back to that family in the state that they live in, obviously, at which point they formally adopted me and were a big part of the reason I was able to even graduate high school on time after all of that. And both when I stayed with them before I was homeless and then after when they adopted me at 17 when I had come back, there were many a weekends where I would sit with my dad or my adopted father, the man I consider my dad, would sit and play this game and talk both about, the secrets, the hidden unmarked stuff. Like I remember when we found the fishing game, which is surprisingly well hidden as an example, and then when we talked through the chaos battle, just all the things that we sat there and figured out and puzzled together. And I would be remiss not to mention then that I think one of the reasons I really love this game so much is because it gave me the opportunity to bond with my dad over a shared interest at a time in my life where it really felt like nobody really cared what I was up to or what I was doing. In fact, I remember being a teenager, especially when I was homeless, where it really felt like most of my life I had been treated more as a tax break than somebody's child. And that was legitimately one of the first times that someone had taken an interest not only in what I was doing, but actually wanted to share that experience with me. And because of that, I of course have a lot of emotions tied up with Final Fantasy XII that have honestly precious little to do with the game itself, that just happened to be the game we were playing. And outside of just how much I actually like the systems and what about the game specifically appeals to me, Final Fantasy XII is, because of the time in which I played it and the nature of playing it with my dad and everything, one of those games that it really is just more than a game to me, because of the experience I had beyond just the literal software of it. And I wanted to share that story here at the end of this review because we are just a little over a week away from Father's Day here in June, and being a father now myself, I truly understand the difference that supporting your kids' interests can really make on their life. And that's why I'm going to end this one a little differently than normal by dedicating it, in fact, to my father. Thanks for playing this with me, Dad.